must say I love the generous custom of clapping when people walk on, even before they've done anything. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to one of the final sessions of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. My name is Simon Longstaff. I'm the Executive Director of St James Ethics Centre and one of the co-curators of the festival. And on behalf of us all, I'd like to welcome you here this evening. There are a few minor housekeeping things to mention. Firstly, if you have your mobile telephone with you, please either turn it off or put it on silent. If you are, especially you, yep. You've got a microphone, you're very impressive. Secondly, if you're inclined to tweet, and really feel free to do so, the hashtag for it is #Fody. Now, the way we're going to proceed during the course of this is that Chris and I are going to have a conversation about some of the ideas that he has about why we should let the banks fail. And then after we've had a bit of a chat, we're going to throw it open for conversation with you. Given the numbers here, I think it should be a conversation. In terms of being able to capture what you say, because they're recording the sessions, there's a microphone just down over there, I think, if it should be, and I don't imagine anybody's upstairs, so that's the one we'll be using. You've seen the little video presentation about the power of the question. Try and keep it pithy. It's not really a debating forum, although we do want to have a contest around the ideas. And that'll give us about, hopefully, 20 minutes or more, maybe even slightly longer actually, more like half an hour, to explore these issues. And we're doing it in the company of a very interesting fellow called Chris Leithner. He has an investment company. He works with others. I think he owns the company. He's also senior scholar with Liberty Australia. And to give you a bit of a flavour for the way his mind turns, one of the books he's written a number, has the very interesting title, The Evil Princes of Martin Place, by which he's referring to the members of the Reserve Bank board, no doubt.
I am.
You are.
And the institution, generally speaking.
And the institution more generally. So let's start off with this. You lump a number of people into the Marxist camp, people who this audience might find a little bit surprising to see included. Mm-hmm. So, for example, John Howard, our former Prime Minister, you would consider buying into the Marxist position. So could you start off by just telling us which bit of Marx you're referring to and why you think John Howard has those Marxist tendencies?
Okay. The document I referred to is Marx's and Engels' Communist Manifesto of 1848. Section 2, if memory serves, lists 10 demands which the workers will forcibly implement when they seize the reins of power from the bourgeoisie. Demand number 5 is a particular interest, and it's not quite an exact quote, my memory's not exact, but a near quote: centralization of credit in the hands of a state bank backed by an absolute monopoly. Centralization of credit in the hands of a state-owned bank in the hands of a monopoly. That sentence, as well as any single sentence, encapsulates, defines, epitomizes the modern contemporary conception of money, banking, and credit. I'm slightly unfair to John Howard or to Margaret Thatcher, who is also an enthusiastic proponent of this, which in effect is central banking. Milton Friedman was an enthusiastic proponent of central banking. Just as an aside, Marxist ideas, as encapsulated in that list of 10 demands, have seeped so deeply into our thinking and into our actions that we're really not aware of it anymore. As an amusing parlor game, it's interesting to go to Google, find the Communist Manifesto, list the 10 demands, and then write down words like Tony Abbott, Julia Gillard, Wayne Swan, and then do Google searches to find citations, quotes from them, just how many of these tenets of the Communist Manifesto they seem to affirm. And your findings might be a bit different from mine. By that criterion, who is a communist? Tony Abbott would be a 50 to 60% communist on the basis of quotations easily discoverable by Google, that seem to affirm tenets of the Communist Manifesto.
This may come to him as a slight surprise, I suspect.
That's why I say these Marxist ideas have seeped so deep into the foundations of our thinking that we're unaware of it. With Julia Gillard, you take your pick, but your findings might be different from mine. She's perhaps a 70 to 80% Marxist, and Wayne Swan and the Greens would be virtual 100% Marxists, defined by adherence on the basis of public quotations that seem to affirm those tenets in the Communist Manifesto. So we live, in that sense, in a communist world. The Soviet Union collapsed. That was regarded as somehow a triumph of democracy. What it should have been regarded as a harbinger of the collapse of Marxism here in the West.
Now, what I should have done at the beginning, before I got into some of the reasons why this is, just to make sure that everybody understands, and you can confirm this business about letting the banks fail, that's not a rhetorical question for you, is it?
Not at all.
You actually believe, and I think you said last night, just let the bastards fail.
Indeed, I did. That's if not an exact verbatim quote, it's a 95% quote. Yes, yeah. Quite right.
So,
and not only just that, it's the fact that they're broke now, or they're bankrupt now, given the sorts of points I raised.
Yeah.
The collapse simply makes plain or makes evident, it causes the scales to fall from people's eyes. It makes plain the bankruptcy which has been inherent all along.
Yeah, and we'll come to that, because your view, as you just said there, is that it's merely just making plain what has already happened. You think they have failed.
Correct.
And that this is both an economic, but even more profoundly a moral problem about propping up an effectively immoral system which has destroyed itself in any case. Now, to get to that conclusion, which is a pretty stark one and which frightened the whole world with the global financial crisis, which you also see as part of this same thing, let's go back into something about what you think has been constructed using number 5 in the Marxist list, this central banking system. And I think you call it fractional
reserve banking.
Yeah. What is fractional reserve banking?
I'll give you the simplest possible example, to the point quite possibly of oversimplifying. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you have a check account at Bank X, doesn't matter which bank it is, with $10,000. There's actually not $10,000 which sits waiting for you to redeem it any time you please. You might think it's a deposit or something which is available upon demand, but in actual fact it isn't. Why? Because the bank has turned around and taken those funds and has lent them. In effect, it's conflated, confused two diametrically different things, a deposit on the one hand and a loan on the other. The point I made the inherent illiquidity in solvency is that if every single person, hypothetically in Australia, sought to redeem those check accounts, the banks wouldn't be able to do it. Only with recourse, because there's only a fraction of those deposits on reserve, only with the help of that backstop could they...
And this is the Basel system, isn't it, where they say there's a certain amount of prudential capital that has to be kept, about 8% or something in different things.
The short answer is yes. The Bank of International Settlements was originally in Basel in Switzerland, where its headquarters established, in effect, and I'm simplifying again, to supervise, to monitor the financial settlements following the First World War. Finding a job to do once that task had been completed, amongst other things, have to do with recommending prudential regulations and things of that nature.
Which is essentially what you're saying, isn't it? That you say, look, of every $10,000 you put in, only a certain proportion of that, 8% or what, I forget whatever the prudential standards are, needs to actually be held by the bank on its balance sheet. The other 92% or so can then be lent to other people, which means it's not... Your argument is, therefore, it's not immediately available for me to make a claim on it. Is that right?
That's basically right. In actual fact, it's not a deposit in the sense that you cannot simply appear and reclaim your property. As opposed, for example, to, let's just say, the Perth Mint, in which you spend X amount of dollars to buy Y ounces of gold. In return, you receive a warehouse certificate which says that you, Simon Longstaff, have a legal right to X amount of gold. Now it's all filled into a big figurative pot there out in Perth. It would be regarded as illegal and immoral if the Perth Mint turned around and on-lent that, or created mortgages and so on, such that there were two competing claims to that same gold. If they were to do it, they'd find themselves in very, 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 very hot water. That's perfectly legal in a purely positive sense, legal standard banking practice has been so for very roughly 150 years. So whilst it seems to me there's everything immoral about it, there's absolutely nothing whatsoever illegal about it.
And what's the problem then with the Reserve Bank and central banks in general in this system?
Several. One is that they were created to rescue what are innately bankrupt institutions, for one. That's point one. Point two is that they finance what I call the welfare warfare state, or in other contexts, the welfare state of credit, that among the privileges which they dispense is financing national governments. Among this process of creating loans, they become the financiers to governments. It's not a coincidence at all that the Federal Reserve System, whilst it was created in 1913, it rose to very great prominence in order to finance America's participation in the First World War. It's not at all a coincidence that the Bank of England began what today would be called open market operations in an aggressive fashion upon at the commencement of the First World War. It's not at all a coincidence that the monetary standard, the gold standard, government suspended it at the commencement of the First World War. Why? Because under all of those sorts of arrangements, governments can't fight wars. So the second criticism, combination of empirical and moral, is that the purpose of a central bank is to finance warfare. It's going to be very difficult to do so without that sort of a backstop.
But there's two kind of parts to your argument there. One is that the problem with the central bank is that it facilitates the fractional banking system. And secondly, that it's also financing governments, I think you're saying, beyond the system itself, to be able to do things which they could not afford to do, and that they maybe ought not to do.
Well, certainly,
like fighting wars, is that right?
Basically, yes, such that today, when I say that the United States government is bankrupt, let me carefully say, what do I mean? That the net present value of its liabilities off balance sheet, but basically the promises which it has made with respect to Medicare, Social Security, according to a fellow Lawrence Kotlikoff at Boston University who studies these sorts of things, as of 30th of June, was on the order of $222 trillion. That's the net present value. That's in effect the reserves that need to exist in order to finance these promises going decades into the future. Those reserves simply don't exist. In other words, the promises aren't going to be kept. Recipients of Medicare aren't going to receive the benefits that politicians solemnly promised to them. Recipients of Social Security, the pension system there, are not going to receive the benefits which politicians solemnly promised to them. Now, are we going to wake up one day and find in big headlines in the New York Times or what have you, U.S. government goes belly up? No. It has begun, and when it began perhaps decades ago, a bankruptcy by stealth, whereby the queues, the waiting list for hip replacements and knee replacements become longer and longer. The purchasing power of Social Security becomes lower and lower. In other words, the people who depend utterly and completely upon the state, those who, alas, believe the politicians, are going to become poorer and poorer. The bankruptcy, the insolvency of the U.S. it has begun to take that form, and as time passes will become more and more apparent in that form.
Now, presumably one of the functions of the central bank in the conditions you described then is to solve this problem by creating more money, by printing more money. And is that not a reasonable solution to the problem? In other words, the institution is doing what it's designed to do?
The short answer is that's what it's trying to do, to paper over the cracks, but ultimately it's not money substitutes, funny money. Simply creating accounting balance sheet entries doesn't create a single additional house, it doesn't create another hospital, it doesn't create an additional tin of baked beans on the supermarket shelf. What it does do is give very privileged people, let's call them for the sake of argument, investment bankers, merchant bankers, first access to those funds, which they then invest. If they spin the wheel, they make a profit on it. Who's last in the queue of the recipients would be people, alas, savers, pensioners and so on. The purchasing power of their currency has been eroded. There's some who do exceedingly well out of this system. There are others who lose massively. So part of the innate immorality of it is the fact that it basically stratifies society into the financial insiders. Mm-hmm. Heads they win, tails taxpayers and society as a general loses, and the outsiders who are barred remained outside, and their only role is much like troops in the First World War, to climb over the trenches and to be shot. They're cannon fodder for the generals who are well behind the front lines.
So let's summarise where we've got to. The basic establishment of central banking as a state monopoly is fulfilling the one aspect of the Communist Manifesto. It's part of the Marxist Engels thesis. It is financing activities by governments which they could not otherwise afford to do, some of which they ought not to do.
Such as war.
Such as war. And this is allied with an international system which is typically introducing fractional reserve banking in societies such that banks as institutions will accept the hard-earned deposits of their savers, and rather than holding them safe in the kind of the cash box, ready to be withdrawn at will, they lend them around to other people to the extent that it's so dissipated that they could not actually pay everybody if they asked for their money to come back. And that this is a system which is essentially bankrupt, and that complicit in it...
Morally and empirically.
Yes. Morally and empirically bankrupt. And that this is something in which politicians and those who benefit from this, namely, I think you're saying the bankers who take first cut on any extra money, are able to drive that system at the cost of the most marginal people in most marginal conditions, hard-working people on low incomes, pensioners and others who progressively see the value of their own savings degraded. Have I got it right so far?
That's a rough and ready, but I think a fair and dispassionate summary of the position.
Okay. Now you link all of this to the global financial crisis, which you say is not a failure of economics so much as an ethical failure or a moral failure. How do you see these things being connected?
Well, we've seen them before in history. We see them in spasms. In 1907, a banking panic, the panic of 1907. We saw, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, a depression of 1920, 1921, which virtually nobody remembers. Why? Because, for various reasons we can discuss, governments did adopt a very strict hair-shirt regimen of austerity. The government of Canada reduced its expenditure by about 50% within the 18 months of the end of the First World War. The US government by about a third. Did it cause an exceedingly deep depression? Yes, it did, but it lasted about 9 months or so. Was there suffering? Unquestionably so, but short and very sharp.
So that was a good response, I take it.
That was a, quote, a good depression in the sense that at least certainly there were people who were suffering, and I don't by any stretch make any light of that. Good in the sense that it was governments somehow behaved themselves, relatively speaking, and therefore it was short. Compare that to 1929 to 1946, when governments did not behave themselves, and they turned, for the same causes that you've begun to describe, the intense meddling, not unlike the meddling we see today, turned what otherwise could have been an exceedingly short and sharp depression, possibly of 1929, 30, 31, into one which lasted until 1946. And I've chosen 1946 quite carefully. There is a folk wisdom that somehow the Second World War extricated the United States from the Depression. If that were logically true, then of course, well, the most prosperous countries would be the ones that wage war, that somehow, and there are people, alas, who say that today, but that's not true at all.
So what happens in 46 if it's not a war? What is it?
The government, far less so than after the First World War, but a drastic pruning of expenditure, reducing regulation, letting price signals tell the truth about time to people to organise their affairs as they saw fit, as opposed to government bureaucrats for their own, and politicians in particular, for their own self-interest. An analogous story that occurred after the First World War, after the Second World War.
Now, that gives me the sense that you are inclined to believe that where there is low levels of regulation, greater price clearing in the marketplace, that this is going to be a healthy response to the conditions that can arise when economies get out of kilter. And yet, when I want to bring you back to the GFC and its causes, you can read quite a lot of people who are arguing that it was a failure of regulation, that there wasn't enough of it in some senses, which...
Indeed, they're arguing for more regulation, more centralisation.
You can see it now, it's happening. So what's your account of the global financial crisis, which has affected lots of people in pretty fundamental ways? You still see it now.
Quick point, I'll get to that. Re-regulation. I don't dispute the importance of regulation. What I talk about, or what I advocate, is self-regulation by individuals. When an individual is faced with the consequences of his or her own actions, it's in one's self-interest to regulate one's own behavior. So I'm not by any stretch of the imagination talking about an absence of regulation. I'm talking about a drastic pruning of government regulation, which virtually by definition is going to be in the interest of the insiders of the haves and not in the interest of the outsiders of the have-nots.
Even put in those terms, there are still plenty of people who are out there now responding to the GFC, increasing government regulation.
Indeed.
So the G20 are really
let's draw the analogy then that I'm not a public health person by any stretch of the imagination, but it's done newspaper articles, TV documentaries. Binge drinking causes great damage in various sorts of ways to the individual, to family relationships, to social relationships, that binge drinking is a bad thing. And yet binge economics is our savior, that a problem, one of whose symptoms was tremendous debt. People are telling us seriously that, well, the solution to that is more debt. A problem caused by misguided regulation, the solution is allegedly more regulation. In other words, we dug ourselves into a hole. The solution to the dilemma is to dig ourselves deeper into a hole. It just doesn't make sense. What does make sense is to rethink things from first principles. What were the causes of previous crises? What are the parallels between those previous ones and the one which began in mid-2007? What were the errors made in the past? To what extent can we rectify errors that were made in the past such that we don't fall into the same sorts of holes into which governments and bureaucrats are digging us at the moment?
Now, my reasonable, it wasn't complete, but reasonably accurate summary of what you'd said showed us why, on your argument, there may be some moral challenges in the system which re-lends the money, and I think people will have arguments about surely that's an efficient way to use it rather than it just sitting around mouldering, waiting for something to happen. But you haven't yet, to my mind at least, made clear what your concerns about fractional reserve banking and the global financial crisis are. What's that about that system and central banking that you think contributes to the GFC?
You're a farmer, let us say, for the sake of argument.
Okay, I'm a farmer.
We'll keep things as simple as possible. You grow 1,000 metric tons of wheat. We'll just keep it as simple as we possibly can. You go to a warehouse and you say, look, for reasons of convenience, I wish to pay you to store that 1,000 metric tons of wheat. It's graded and so on, it's established, that's exactly what it is. They give you a certificate to say that you, Simon Longstaff, in this particular warehouse have 1,000 metric tons of wheat. Would you or would you not regard it as an infraction of ethics if somehow that grain warehouse issued counterfeit warehouse receipts, rather than, for the sake of argument, a sum total of 5 farmers, each of whom have 1,000 metric tons in that warehouse? The warehouse issues certificates totaling 10,000 metric tons and receives money in exchange for them. You would be shortchanged, and for reasonably obvious reasons. Is that fundamentally different from what Ben Bernanke does, that there is not a single additional car that's been produced, there's not a single additional house that's been produced, ton of grain that's been produced, but by adding accounting entries, vastly more money substitutes, if I can use that phrase, have been created, hence the decrease in purchasing. To return your question, we've seen this movie several times before. The GFC is simply the latest episode, and it gets a bit boring because this episode is pretty much the same in terms of its fundamentals as those previous episodes. Think in terms of a volcanologist or a seismologist. A seismologist can tell you with reasonable accuracy where the fault lines lie, but alas can't tell you with absolute accuracy exactly when the earthquake is going to erupt. So I don't know, I can't explain to you why it was in mid-2007 as opposed to mid-2005, etc., etc. But given the points we've raised, there are the fault lines in the banking system, and the earthquake has appeared in the past. There was a severe tremor in the Northern Hemisphere, and it seems to me that we too in Australia have our fault lines. Do we have any logical reasons to say that we somehow are immune from future tremors? It seems to me that we have no such reason.
Now, when the shock came with the GFC, there was discussion about letting the banks fail, and one of the concepts that entered into our language was the notion that some banks were too big to fail. And the reason seemed to be, and I'm not an expert on this, but I imagine intuitively we were thinking that in the world you've described where we are all interdependent in a sense because we've made our deposits, the money's been distributed through the fractional reserve system into other investments, if one fails, particularly one that's a large one, then we're all going down the tubes, because those of us who have made deposits are going to lose everything. So why is it that you are committed, and you seem to be, concerned to minimise harm? Why would you want to adopt a position that banks should be allowed to fail when the fact in the circumstances you described of this interdependent leverage system, one goes, they're probably all going to go if they're big enough.
I don't disagree with the prognosis. If one goes, then others may well follow suit. And great harm, it's not that the collapse of those banks and the headlines would somehow cause problems. The problems were created decades ago.
Yeah,
that would simply reveal the
them
problem, crystallise them. So the choice is to recognise the addiction, recognise the problem, and to try to do something about it, or once again to paper it over and to create even bigger problems for the future. To say, look, let's have another round of binge drinking that Uncle Fred, alas, has a severe alcohol problem. I know what we'll do. Let's send him on a pub crawl to have a big blinder and so on, so he's going to feel good for a day or so. Let's never mind the fact that if we continue to do that, it's going to kill him. To fail to identify these problems and to say, look, whatever we do, there's going to be pain. To some limited extent, we can avoid pain upon the most marginal and concentrate the pain upon the co-conspirators and so on. But the pain exists. People in Greece know that.
But that doesn't happen. We don't ever have... if it was let bankers fail, you'd probably hear a roar from the crowds of people. But what tends to happen is that we privatise the upside and we socialise the downside. You can see it now, as you say, the people of Greece are paying a pretty terrible price for others who seem to have walked away from the consequences of their own decisions.
Well, I don't disagree, but what you've described to me is something akin to a Stockholm syndrome. Those who suffer the most are somehow the most enthusiastic proponents of the very people who have imprisoned them.
So describe to me what you think the world's going to be like if people adopt your prescription and let the banks fail. I mean, what do you think is going to happen?
In the short term, there's no question about it. There's going to be suffering. Let me use my analogy.
I'll lose my house.
Do you have a mortgage over your house?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, then flip a coin. Chances are that, yes, you could. And I'm not denying that. I can't sit here and say otherwise. Let me put it in a slightly different way.
Is that the good news or the bad news?
That's the news, I suppose. In some sense, for creditors, it's very good news that the system, in terms of benefiting some, penalising others, is one that drastically benefits debtors and, in effect, punishes savers. Savers have got the short end of the stick for decades upon decades upon decades.
But how is this good for savers either? I mean, if the bank's failing, don't they lose everything that they've committed to by way of savings to this institution that's about to disappear?
Let's compare your house, over which there is a mortgage, to an unmortgaged house. It seems to me that folks with mortgages stand to lose. Those without mortgages stand to lose less. We flipped the coin whereby, for the first time in quite a long time, debtors are particularly vulnerable, and debtors take a particular hit, and savers suffer less. On Tuesday, when the board of the Reserve Bank meets, it's a plea to deaf ears. But here's this committee of central planners who are going to sit down and conspire to, yet again, probably to dud savers and to reward debtors. There's a moral issue there. It's not addressed.
And you're saying there, just to be clear, you're thinking if they cut the rates and if those rates are passed on, it's going to be an unjust windfall to debtors at the expense of savers.
What else can it be?
Right.
If it's a committee of central planners who, as a committee, they're not omniscient, they're not omnipotent, they'll willingly tell you, we're not able to prophesy the price of petrol in a year's time or a barrel of oil in US dollars in a year's time, but for reasons unknown to the general public, they claim to know the proper price of something called an overnight cash rate, a rate of interest in which exchanged by banks on a very short-term basis. I don't criticize them for getting things wrong. If I were in their position, I'd get it wrong far more quickly. There'd be a crisis much more quickly and probably a much bigger one. What I criticize them for is presuming to know. No individual human being, no committee of human beings can know the time preferences of people in society, the value they place upon time. What's the value of my savings today? How much am I willing to save in order how much am I willing to to forego today in order for additional jam tomorrow. And they're tampering with that. They're sending out false signals. In effect, they're telling untruths about time. Getting back to your previous point, would there be suffering if the banks failed? Unquestionably so. It seemed to me the suffering would be concentrated amongst virtually everybody would suffer, particularly debtors as opposed to creditors and savers. Is that unjust? Well, it seems to me that it's less invidious than the situation for decades and decades and decades. People have been trained and inured to say that take out debt, more debt is better, mortgage the house, use the house as collateral for something else, and so on. The underlying idea has been that the way to wealth is through debt. It seems to me if moral principles prevailed, people would rightly regard, as our forebears did in the 19th century, that morally and empirically debt is the route to perdition.
Now, your dangerous idea's got a couple of edges to it. One is about letting the banks fail.
Yep.
More radically, I think you would actually not let the Reserve Bank fail, but you would
abolish it outright. Yes.
Right. So let's talk a bit about this. Because
quick interjection, though,
yep.
And I suppose I'm going to disappoint you. It seems to me what I'm proposing is not dangerous. Let's draw the distinction between a radical and an extremist. In the notes which you've kindly put together for presentations, presenters should be as extreme as possible. Let's go back to the Latin roots of these terms. A radical
means go to the root.
Get to the root of something.
Yeah.
A radical seeks to solve problems. Let's go to the root of extreme at the outermost and so on. Extremists are people who cause problems. So here's my disappointment to you. I don't think that human liberty is a dangerous idea. I think it's quite safe. I don't think that I'm an extremist. I might be a radical. Who are the extremists? It's people in central banks who say, look, in effect, we have failed. We've presided over a failed system. Let's be even more extreme. Let's pile even more debt
I don't
into
think we have
system.
to label you radical or extreme, just to find out what you think, though. Which is that you want then now the banks are failed, allowed to fail, and you abolish the Reserve Bank and presumably the central banks in every country.
Yep.
Now, what then happens? I mean, what does the work that they were doing before? And I can see that part of why you want to get rid of them is that they're financing things like war and other things by states. But what do you replace all of this with?
Free individuals acting in their own self-interest. Let me approach it in another way. Surely it's not a radical idea. Surely it's a pillar of modernity to separate church and state. What I'm proposing, in effect, is to separate the state on the one hand and money and banking on the other. That's not an extremist or a dangerous idea. It seems to me that's common sense, given the behavior of governments over hundreds of years and millennia. They lie, they cheat, they steal, and above all, they kill. So my proposal is, call it at the very core of the Western tradition. If we believe in the separation of church and state, which theologians, including Martin Luther, gave us ample grounds to do, then surely it's just a big stifling yawn. I perhaps have brought people here on false pretenses. It's a pillar of modernity to separate these two things. I don't want, let's get the state out of the bedroom with respect to gay marriage. Let's get the state out of the boardroom with respect to finance and economics.
And how would you do this? I mean, because ought implies can, right? So there's got to be a practical chance of this being done. Do you draft a bill that abolishes the Reserve Bank on the 1st of January 2013 and then it all rips? What are the mechanisms by which you actually think this could be done?
The first initial response is a cowardly one. We don't live in that sort of a world in which the discipline of a gold standard prevailed. We don't live in a world in which people by and large say, I want to stand on my own 2 feet. If I stuff my hip, I have to pay for it, as opposed to put my lot into the taxpayers and to finance it. So this is something that's not going to happen tomorrow, the next day, or next year and whatnot. So that's a cowardly answer. The second answer, though, is that human beings don't, it seems to me, and you can correct me because I'm undoubtedly wrong to some extent, think things through very carefully from first principles and then calmly, dispassionately debate and discuss and enact. They basically respond to absolutely crippling crises. So during the Great Depression, ideas were foisted upon them to say, this was caused by evil plutocrats and so on. My name is Franklin Roosevelt. Vote for me for reasons A, B, and C, X, Y, and Z, and so on. And people bought it lock, stock, and barrel.
You're not a fan of the New Deal, I take it.
The short answer, no, I'm not.
Right.
The folk wisdom is that it saved America from the Great Depression. Quite the contrary, it lengthened and deepened it. So, no.
And so the idea is that if there was a crisis that precipitated a major review of the kind that you're proposing, it would focus more on individuals making their self-interested choices, and effectively you're a champion, I suppose, for the freedom of the individual,
yes.
the market, with as small amount of intervention by government as is strictly to the level that is strictly necessary.
If and when I make a mistake, wearing my hat as an individual, it affects me and my family, and bad luck for us. If running my company I make a mistake, then it affects obviously myself and the shareholders. If Ben Bernanke makes a mistake, or I should say when he makes a mistake, or Sir Merv Keane or Glenn Stevens, it affects everybody. Decentralization, then, it seems to me, is a way by which, when human beings, by their very nature, are going to disagree about certain things, the analogy then, there'll be some who favour gay marriage, others who disagree with it. People are going to dispute that and come to blows, privatise, get rid of the Marriage Act, decentralise. In some churches, people would be married, in others they wouldn't. People who are not of faith could make their own arrangements as they saw fit and stuff others who disagree with them. It's not a case of one size fits all. If it's going to be a case of one size fits all, there are inevitably going to be winners and there are inevitably going to be losers. Decentralise, let people make their own decisions. If they make a mess of things, that's very unfortunate, but for themselves, as opposed to the tremors, the shock waves, when an all-knowing, allegedly omniscient bureaucrat...
So formally mandated state institutions should be getting as far as way out of not just economics but life in general. Now, I'm going to go to the audience in a minute, but before I do, I just want you to speak a bit about the model you have in mind for a successful bank, because it's got two attributes. One, as I understand it, is that it receives deposits which it does not on lend, but holds them exclusively available to those who deposited them.
That's right.
And then it has a second function, which is as an investment vehicle, within which people, if they want to make an investment for a return, can lend it money for distribution through its lending activities. Is that something like that?
That's the gist of it. National Citibank in New York City, JP Morgan's vehicle, did not pay interest on deposits until well after the Second World War.
So the deposits, they don't pay interest either, the ones...
Quite the contrary. It was such a stronghold, a lockbox, that people paid for the privilege of depositing their funds into this bank. So that's point one.
Like today, where we get to pay.
How would banks earn their money? Because you'd find it inconvenient to stuff it under your mattress or into the back garden, be thrown into a pool, you'd receive the warehouse certificate, etc., or the computer equivalent, and it would be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You, as an investor, might decide,
Let's be clear with this. My deposits are safe, and rather than receiving interest for deposits, I am probably paying the bank a
for
fee
the service
to keep my money safe.
In the same way you would pay Kennard's storage for the privilege of storing your family.
Now I've got another part of my money that I might want to invest.
Which you might decide, this is entrepreneurial capital as opposed to transactional funds, and I reckon... Oh, and by the way, quick point, deposits. It is not because the government says so or mandates it or guarantees it or insures it. It's simply because the reputation of the bank into which you make that deposit is such that you're prepared, you look under the bonnet, you kick the tires, etc. Over the course of X amount of years, it has a well-deserved reputation for security of deposit. So that's point one. Where does it make money? Point two, you have, for the sake of argument, $100,000 spare capital. You wish to invest it. You have a range of options, but you might decide, these fellows in this particular bank seem to be skilled as brokers marrying my investment funds with, for the sake of argument, local small business people. So you say to them, here's my $100,000, I sign it over to you for the sake of argument, 1 year at 10%. I'm just plucking this out
like
of
a
thin
bond.
air. It is a bond. That's precisely what it is.
Right.
And then the bank then turns around and says to X number of, for the sake of argument, local business people, we think you are creditworthy, and so we lend to you, I'm just plucking this number out of thin air to keep the maths extremely simple, 20%. And the second source of their profit, or at least of their revenue, I should say, is the margin between those two rates of interest. Critical point, fundamental point. Should those investments go dud, you lose as a bondholder, but the depositors are utterly and totally unaffected.
So they're not affected by speculation.
Correct. Speculation, if they want to participate in it as bondholders, bless them, all power to them. But if they want nothing to do with that, then they absolutely have nothing to do with it, and they don't suffer the consequences if and when things go bad on the investment side.
Now, when I quoted you about let the bastards fail, you said that was accurate. Why are they bastards? I mean, I can see it might be dysfunctional, you might think it's getting in the way, but to use the term bastard makes it sound like you think they're doing something wrong.
Well, they're white-collar wharfies. As we speak today...
Bankers are white-collar wharfies.
Why do I say this?
Yeah. Why do you say that?
Let us take the case of the United States as we speak today. I spoke of this funny money central banks have created. In one sense of it, or one form of it, don't take my word for it, in that Marxist publication, The Wall Street Journal, an article earlier this month, 18th I think it was, one of whom was an ex-Secretary of State, George Shultz. One was an exceedingly mainstream, renowned, competent economist, John B. Taylor, at Stanford University. Indeed, all the authors, I think, were at the Hoover Institution there. And they pointed out a couple of disturbing facts, and I think they did use the word disturbing. In order to bail out the banks, what has the Fed done? It has credited their accounts with, a drum roll please, $1.5 trillion. Good money if you can get it. The Fed pays interest on those funds. It's a minuscule amount, about 1/4 percentage point, but...
Receives interest on the funds?
Yes, the banks receive interest on those deposits from the Fed, and that's a free gift of about, and my maths are not that good on the trot in front of the lights, $3 or $4 billion per year. It doesn't end there. We still haven't got to the steak knives. If the banks so chose, thus far they haven't, but if they so chose, they can conceivably turn that 1.5 or so trillion into, and I'm being extraordinarily concerned, it's not going to happen, so I'm extrapolating here, into, say, $100 trillion worth of loans. Plucking funds in, if they lend it out at 3%, interest margin at, say, 2%, that's another $20 billion of profit. That's a lot of money. And it's a free gift from their good friends at the corner of Constitution Avenue and Constitution and 21st Avenue in Washington, D.C., namely the Federal Reserve. They regard this as a matter of right. When the balloon goes up, they trot it up and down saying, bail us out or all hell is going to break loose.
Because they use this to
there exists an entitlement mentality.
But they actually want to maintain liquidity, credit in the market, don't they? That's what they're using it as, capital, so that they can continue to lend, so the wheels keep turning.
It's funny, is it not? The wheels keep turning, my word, so that the insiders get a lot of what's got going, and the outsiders continue to suffer at their hands. They regard this as a matter of entitlement. Right? Okay. They're onto a good thing, and they're not about to let it go. The United States government is onto a good thing. If it were not for the Fed, they couldn't finance themselves, and welfare and warfare would be something that they'd have to put up their hands and say, sorry, folks, the larder is empty.
And it's not just warfare, it's welfare too.
Of course, or domestic warfare against Americans, yes.
Okay, now, are there any people here who would like to ask Chris a question or make a comment briefly? Come down if you can. There's a microphone just down here. And we've got about 15 minutes or so to go. I'm sorry it's a little bit shorter than I thought, but I wanted to make sure we had a good sense of what Chris's dangerous or radical idea was. Yeah, so if you can just give your name, try not to go on too long. But
my name is Ravi. I'm totally and completely lost by your argument, so let me say that up front. But if I understand you correctly, you're saying all sorts of leveraging is bad, so nobody should put anything in the bank and they should not on-lend it. So that means there should be zero leverage. Nobody should take credit card debt and nobody should take a housing loan.
Wrong, and wrong. I've said none of those things, nor have I implied
Well, that's what you said. I mean, that's what I heard. So first of all, I wanted to make sure my hearing was correct.
I don't think I uttered the phrase credit card in anything I said, for starters. So to be respectful to you, no, I don't think...
I think you did suggest that those who take out mortgages are failing to learn the lessons of their forefathers, that it's better not to have any debt.
That's correct.
Given the system in which we operate, that all the rewards have been placed upon debtors.
Well, credit card is also a debt, isn't it?
Sorry?
Credit card is also a debt.
It's a debt to you, in effect, to a bank through a merchant. Okay.
Absolutely. So, yes. I'm correct so far. So all of these are... So you should remove all those leverages. If you remove that much money from the system, then clearly you go back to a situation where you have to go back and live in caves because you have to basically break up the entire economic system.
No. Let's take credit cards as an example. How would a bank finance credit cards? It would assemble investors, perhaps this fellow here and others, pool the funds, for the total of, I'm simply keeping the funds very simple, $100 million. That would be a loan from those investors to the bank, which the bank could pool itself or elsewhere, would then use as the source for individuals who had credit cards. In other words, it would not involve depositors in any way, shape, or form. If the bank so chose, if its entrepreneur, in terms of a source, regarded that as a source of profit, there's nothing whatever implicit in what I've said that would make credit cards a thing of the past.
I think, Ravi, just to be clear, that what he was saying is that he may not like debt. What he's opposed to
but you're free to take it out if you so choose.
He doesn't like using people's deposits as the basis for lending to others. If others want to provide money which can be invested for the purposes of loans, then that is a reasonable thing. So liquidity wouldn't completely disappear.
It would, because you want no leverage. You want, basically to do that, so it would. However, having said that, you can do what you said today. You can put your money in a locker in the bank. You don't have to give it to them for interest. There is absolutely nothing stopping you from doing that. I mean, I could do it today. In fact, a lot of people who try to avoid the pension system because they want to show less assets keep $50,000 at home, according to this newspaper, today because they don't want to show it as an asset. So there's nothing stopping you from doing that. The banks provide that service today. So I don't really understand what's so special about this. If your fundamental issue is leverage, that's correct. But then you have to agree that the economy will collapse completely. Now, but by the way, there's nothing wrong with the economy collapsing as long as we agree that we want to go back to a collapsed economy. But I'm not sure we'd agree with that.
As a mortgage holder, I'm not too keen on the economy collapsing, Ravi. We'll take the next question. You say your name. Just the microphone if you want, so it comes down a bit. Yeah.
I'm Gabby. I was just wondering, given that the interest rates are in effect compensating consumers for the inflation that they will face, that is inevitable by the actions of the economy, are we just going to see a depletion of our savings over time until we all have zero balances? Is that what's going to happen?
Okay,
in your utopia?
Yeah, in your world where no interest is paid on deposits, where you may even pay a fee. I think, Gabby, tell me if I'm getting this right. Inflation is going to erode the value of our savings without that, so that over time it has nothing, and depositors are ultimately at a loss.
Reflect. Between the end of the American Civil War in 1865 and the beginning of the 20th century, 1900, the first couple of years of the 20th century, the overall price level gently fell. Wages, very roughly, and I'm drastically simplifying, rose marginally, roughly stable, but the one apple, which your $1 per hour, whatever it was, could buy in the 1860s, bought 2.5 or 3 by the turn of the century. Inflation would be non-existent, it seems to me, or close to it. In actual fact, it would be what's called a good thing, the increase of the purchasing power of your wages, etc., a gentle deflation.
So how does this system cause a deflation?
Because the amount of money is not increasing, or money substitutes is not increasing by leaps and bounds, as it has been basically since the beginning of the 20th century, with a much more static or only very, very slowly rising amount, as productivity through the entrepreneurship, the genius of individuals, etc., people other than me, more stuff, similar amount of money, means greater amount of stuff purchased per unit of currency. That's the opposite of inflation, it seems to me. Whereas what we have today is a growing amount of stuff, but an even more rapidly growing amount of money substitutes, such that it's like the hamster in the cage. You have to run just to stand still.
A quick response from Gabby and then the person behind you.
So what you're saying is that the effect of labour would be marginal relative to the effect that the entrepreneurial aspect of inputs would be.
I don't know who'd be the winners.
But that's the implication, because the higher wages that are gained through labour will not pass on to the actual final product, because the entrepreneurial aspect of that will take away from it.
To be honest, I don't know how labour versus capital is going to be carved up in a system like this. Conceivably, there can be situations whereby, for demographic reasons, labour is relatively scarce and therefore labour becomes dearer. Possibly for demographic reasons, labour becomes cheaper, and a spurt of an entrepreneurship makes those sorts of functions more valuable. So I don't think there's any obvious implication to draw in one direction or the other.
Okay, let's take the next person, please. You can talk about that after and work out what happens between labour.
Hi, I'm Lydia. I just wanted to know whether there was anything preventing you and I starting this model of bank tomorrow.
The short answer is, I suppose, the Reserve Bank Act, the Banking Act, possibly the Tax Act, I guess.
Okay.
That's just off the top of my head, so my guess is that the full weight and force of the law.
Do you know that you can't use the word banking in a name without permission from the regulators? So that's one of the things. I discovered that later on. So,
I've just got another quick question.
two questions.
Yeah,
right.
with moving to a sort of self-governance and individual responsibility of managing your finances, what sort of responsibility does that put on schools and with children in teaching them how to do that? Because I don't think I recall ever being taught how to handle money, except for maybe examples in maths class.
Financial literacy, yeah.
Yes. Surely it's in the parents' wish to inculcate the values as they see them into their kids, just as I would advocate removing the state from the boardroom, the bedroom, or remove it from the schoolroom. Parents would make their own decisions or would band together. Would the school concentrate on science and maths? Would it concentrate on music and the arts? Would it concentrate on grammar and literature, or a combination of all three? In other words, parents themselves, it seems...
But would you encourage them to have financial literacy as part of this?
I'd encourage them to have word literacy, numeric literacy, and financial literacy, but the critical point, it's not my position to say so. Any parent should tell me to go get stuffed when it comes to their education with respect to their kids. That's a matter between them and the kids.
Okay.
I thought the subprime problem we had in the States is because the regulation was dropped and it allowed those investment banks to able to invest in that area. So I can't see why you would foster on deregulation. Would you like to answer that question?
Well, it seems to me subprime issues were a trigger as opposed to a cause, a symptom on the underlying problem as opposed to the ultimate cause. That's point one. I'll try to repeat what I said. Regulation, of course regulation, but regulation at the individual level as opposed to the level of the state. If the state regulates, why is it, for example, if we assume the state is going to regulate, almost by necessity we have to assume that as soon as someone steps into a building in the civil service, they sprout a halo over their head. Are people only self-interested in regard to the marketplace, but bureaucrats are altruistic?
Yeah, but Chris, I mean,
I don't have enough faith
I'm not
to
a great
believe that.
fan of regulation myself, but I'm going to get on a plane on Tuesday and I'm
Yes.
going to head off overseas, and I don't want the pilots to say, let's forget about the checklist and go for a bit of a fly.
Why would the pilots say that?
But equally, I want there to be an air traffic control system in which the regulation of departures and arrivals...
Presumably the pilot doesn't want to crash.
I know,
Presumably the airline doesn't want to crash.
But that is a collective decision-making made by the government to regulate the airspaces of the nation so that there aren't these sorts of mishaps taking place. I mean, would you not see that kind of central regulation?
No, I'd go as far to say, put it this way, that let's put it in an American context. All this idiotic so-called anti-terrorist legislation, let us have Second Amendment flights in the United States. Airlines would simply deem them to be. If you want to carry a submachine gun on the plane, you do so.
And you'd let them?
Beg your pardon?
And you would let them?
Who am I to tell them no? Now, people who don't want to fly...
No, seriously, would you say, is this a serious proposal, that there could be Second Amendment flights for people with machine guns?
I can't put my finger on that part of the Constitution that gives the government the authority to ban weapons on airlines.
So you're saying, yes, you would let them?
Because the Constitution doesn't give me any grounds to do so.
Okay. Yes?
Just talking
You
about...
see, it is called Liberty Australia, that is... I'm just saying,
And of course,
you're a libertarian.
Very quick ad, for many folks who would not want to fly in this sorts of plane, bless them, they don't have to do so. They can fly on a plane in which the airline says, look, we will take security steps A, B, C, D, E, and G, and if you prefer those measures, then bless you, you fly on that flight, as opposed to the Second Amendment flight.
Okay.
Look, here in Australia, as I'm sure you're aware, we have got a highly regulated system, and our four big banks didn't fail during the GFC. But I'd be very interested in your comment about other parts of the globe that fared very well because they didn't have the risky lending, and I'm talking about credit unions and one of the world's biggest banks, Raiffeisen, for example, that did, in fact, increased its membership. These are member-owned banks, the credit unions here in Australia. They haven't, I guess, had the same level playing field as far as bank protection. But I'd just like to hear your comment as far as other parts of the world, and particularly banks like Raiffeisen and so on that really did well, that didn't have to have the bailouts that Babcock and Brown, for example. In the UK.
There's a film you were talking about last night, which was a bit about this, wasn't it?
If so, I've forgotten.
This Wonderful Life, or...
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It's a Wonderful Life, the James Stewart film.
And
That's right.
Move Your Money in the UK gave people the opportunity to move their money out of the big banks.
Very brief point. Alas, I'm ignorant of the inner workings of Raiffeisen and other Kasse in Germany, so alas, there's nothing coherent I can say. There's nothing much incoherent I can say. Quick anecdotal comment. The biggest insured bank failure in US history was Washington Mutual. I emphasize the word mutual, such that is there a single, can one make an across-the-board, I'm violating one of my own rules here, can one make a single across-the-board characterization with respect to thrifts, credit unions, etc., etc.? My guess is probably, well, I'll go on a limb and say no, one can't, so I'm ignorant about the case you raise, but a counter case, one of the biggest amalgamations of credit unions in the US, or rough equivalents thrifts, did collapse. But
it'd be one of the only ones that did. And in fact, Gordon Brown in London said that we'll to some of the big banks, and I think it was Babcock, that we'll bail you out. However, you will remutualise when things improve.
Okay. So really, the nub of the question is there something about mutuals, member-owned institutions, which is preferable to the joint stock public companies that are banks today?
My short answer would be no. I've tarred the brush with fractional reserve banks, most of which credit unions, thrifts and so on would fall into that category as well. But I'm prepared for someone to show me evidence otherwise, that net of the criticisms I've made, there is a distinction to be drawn.
The gentleman behind you.
I agree with everything that you've said, and I think one of the biggest problems in the United States, especially among the politicians that I've seen, except for one, Ron Paul, is the complete lack of real understanding of these issues. So given that that's the case, how do you see this saga really playing out over the next 5, 10, 20 years with the Federal Reserve, the debt, because it's clearly not sustainable into the long term?
Yep. I'll give another cowardly answer. I wish I had a crystal ball. Alas, I haven't. You mentioned Ron Paul. Let me mention something about him. His, I think, signal contribution to politics and society and culture in the United States, I think he's been a big influence in one critical way. I'll approach this in a kind of a roundabout Austrian school way. A decade ago, Alan Greenspan, the head of the Fed, was deified. He'd present himself at Congress and he would utter he'd babble in central bank Esperanto. He'd be treated with reverence and respect and so on, and he'd trot off again for 6 months. Thanks, I think, to Ron Paul, Ben Bernanke now gets not quite derision, but he gets a lot of hostility on Capitol Hill. A lot of Americans realize they've disliked banks. A lot of Australians for a long time have disliked banks, and they haven't quite been, they're trying to put food on the table, they're working, etc., etc., they're repaying mortgages, they can't quite put their finger on why. Ron Paul has helped them to understand why. So the important part of your question, alas, I haven't a crystal ball, so I'll just venture a guess that America's credit rating, be it Standard & Poor's, be it Moody's, be it Fitch, another notch is stripped from it every couple of years or so, i.e., the realization begins to dawn at some stage that promises politicians have made simply can't be kept. And we come to a point, this is where I'm hypothesizing, I'm just, others will know this far better than me. You can have a welfare state, you can have a warfare, in other words, you can have a Pentagon, an overseas empire. You can have Social Security and Medicare whose real purchasing value falls over time, but you can't have both. Now, we're not remotely close to that point. When I see a Republican who's prepared to slash the budget of the Pentagon by 2/3, when I hear a Democrat who's prepared to tell the truth about Social Security and Medicare, then I'll know that sort of people... in a free society, the politicians are afraid of the people. In an unfree society, people are afraid of politicians. Alas, America is very much an unfree society, so that some more of the same, only marginally worse over the next several years is my stab in the dark.
Just very quickly, if I may. Do you think part of the problem is that the Austrian school doesn't have nearly as much power or influence in the educational system as perhaps the Keynesian school?
The short answer is yes.
It'll have to be the short answer because we have to finish.
Yep.
So.
I wouldn't want it to have any power, certainly influence, but the short answer is yes.
If you've got a question, sorry about that, mate, you won't be able to do it because we haven't got time, but if you want to catch Chris, you'll be able to do so after. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Leithner has presented his dangerous idea about letting banks fail, but not just that, the abolition of the Reserve Bank, and you can imagine for yourself, and I think he's acknowledged it will be painful, but he believes it to be a pain worth bearing for the long term in the name of liberty. I'm keen to have him back in some time in the future to talk about why welfare is warfare on the people. That would be an interesting, which I think you'd be up to talking about. But as our time has elapsed, can you please join with me in thanking Chris Leithner?
Thank you. Thank you.